All right. Well, I am now joined by friend of the channel, Ben Burgis. You know him from his show, Give Them an Argument. Ben is also a prolific writer and author, so I have lost track of what your most recent book is, Ben. I think it's the Christopher Hitchens.
It is.
It is. What's the title?
Christopher Hitchens, what he got right, how he went wrong, and why he still matters.
There you go. On that note, Ben, I wanted to have you on to talk about the culture wars.
Hmm.
Now, specifically, I think that both you and I are pretty anti-culture war. We're class war, not culture war. But I've noticed that on the left, or at least among progressives, there has been kind
Mm.
of this sentiment bubbling up recently that actually we should be fighting the culture wars, or there are times in which it makes sense for the left to engage in and fight the culture wars. So, I've seen, a couple different tweets to this effect. I know
Hmm.
that Jamel Bowie has a new article or a recent article in the New York Times where he very explicitly says Democrats should be fighting the culture wars. I think Jonathan Chait over at New York Magazine has written about it too. So I've got some thoughts on this, but I wanted to open it up to you first as the guest of honor. When and how should the left fight the culture wars, if we should at all?
Yeah, I basically think we shouldn't. So I think that it's probably worth making a couple of distinctions here. So when
Yeah.
people talk about this, I think whatever kind of like aura of plausibility it has when they say things like this, oh, you just need to win the culture war, you can't avoid
Hmm.
the culture war, whatever, I think comes from the fact that they're kind of mixing up two different things. Like one is what I'd actually think of as the culture war, which is wars that you're fighting over culture.
Right.
So you're fighting about sensibilities. How do you how do you feel about pronouns in the bio on Twitter? How do you feel about Joe Rogan? Do you do whatever, like all of that stuff, right? Do you think that celebrity who said something outrageous last week should apologize, or would that be surrendering to the Twitter mob?
Hmm.
Like that's culture war. And then the other issue is like social policy battles, like
Right.
should you have anti-discrimination laws and stuff like that. And of course, look, I mean, we're going to have laws. They will or won't include like different things that, different social policies. The left has principles,
Hmm.
we're obviously going to apply them there. We should apply them there. But what I would urge is you don't have to fight these as proxies for the culture war, right?
Yes.
You can have positions on laws without, treating it as this part of this endless battle between media narratives, between sensibilities, where everybody who you don't like, if you're on one side is a white supremacist, and everybody you don't like, and if you're on another is a cultural Marxist, right? You can
Hmm.
kind of opt out of that framing.
Yeah, I want to specifically bring up something that Jamel Bowie wrote in his article because I think it's really interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
he makes the case that the reason why the left or Democrats or people who are progressive should be fighting the culture wars is because they are actually a Trojan horse for something else. And in his
Mm-hmm.
piece, he sort of brings up the critical race theory fights that are bubbling up around public schools. He brings up the anti-LGBTQ laws in Florida that Disney has waded into. And with respect to the schools, he says, well, what the right is actually trying to do here is they're trying to like foment a panic about critical race theory creeping into children's education, but they're actually trying to undermine public education. And there have
Mm-hmm.
been, figures on the right, such as this guy, Chris Rufo, who's sort of the main figurehead behind the, critical race theory panic, who have explicitly said that's what we're trying to do. Like Chris Rufo
Mm-hmm.
has, gone on record saying, I like charter schools, and that's kind of like the second prong of my attack in going after public schools and what they're teaching. So I think that there is a kernel of truth there that
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes these culture wars sort of mask more material fights, I guess you could say. But at the same time, I guess I'm just not convinced that like in order to defend public education, we have to fight Chris Rufo on his own terms. So I don't know. What are
Mm-hmm.
your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I read that Jamel Bowie article, and I thought the first two-thirds were actually good, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like the first like two-thirds what he said when he's talking about the right's motivations and how they're against public education and all that,
Mm-hmm.
which of course they are, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because A, it's public, and B, it's unionized, right? So of
Yeah.
course they don't like any of that. So I thought that was all correct, but then like the last third where he starts drawing conclusions, I was like, hold on, right? Like
Yeah.
the conclusions are all like, okay, therefore lead into culture war, and we should be all in. And also, Democrats aren't talking about this enough.
Right.
Like,
Right.
really?
Yeah.
Like, it
Yeah,
seems
that
like
was
that's
the part. Yeah, exactly. Like that was the part that I don't know, like kind of made me like start or whatever. Because if you ask me, Democrats are only participating in culture war.
exactly,
Like, what
yeah.
do you call Gavin Newsom tweeting a picture of him holding up Toni Morrison's Beloved or whatever and being like, take this, red states? Like, what is that? That's not defending public education.
No, no, absolutely not. I mean, and in fact, Gavin Newsom, I mean, it's one of my favorite examples because late last year, I actually wrote an article for Jacobin about this. The title that I mean, whatever, you don't get to pick the title, but the proposed title that I put in was Gavin Newsom is a piece of shit, but they didn't.
Boscar rejected that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was next, but like at the same time, Newsom, like within a week of each other, he did two things. One of
Mhm.
which was to institute this requirement for a ethnic studies class to graduate from high school in California, and the other was to nix what would have been this like big expansion of financial aid, especially
Mhm.
community college students in
Yeah.
California, and which is amazing because like even if you I mean I've got a lot of I mean I'm very sympathetic to the kind of critique that people like Adolph Reed and Walter Ben Michaels will make of like sort of making everything about disparities, and like
Yeah.
having that be the sort of main framing for thinking about injustice. But putting that aside, right? I mean, like this really is, like not being able to afford to go to college, the community college thing, like that really is very racially disproportional. So if you actually want to do something about that, that would, be not a bad thing to do.
Right.
Whereas just like kind of having another class that people are going to sleep through, on their way to graduation is kind of pointless. But why is
Mhm.
he doing that? He's doing that to score points with Team Blue in the culture war. Look how
Mhm.
virtuous he is. That he's willing to do this. That as these other places are going after critical race theory, that Gavin Newsom is actually requiring ethnic studies. I mean, this is. I mean, I don't know. My memory extends long enough that I can remember the 2020 Democratic Convention when Elizabeth Warren was speaking with BLM spelled out in children's blocks behind her.
I had blanked that out, but thank you for putting that back on my radar. Yes, I remember now.
Like I've heard every big mainstream Democrat, use phrases like structural racism.
Yep.
I've heard every big mainstream Democrat like signal all of the everything cultural that they could that these people could possibly want them to signal because it's easy, it's painless, right?
Yeah.
I mean you
Yeah.
can have you can say like because it's about cultural sensibilities, but you could have any cultural sensibilities and continue to have continue to have the, muddy commodity money machine keep whirring, along like it always has, right? I mean, like that's like, you can have the same companies, do business just as profitably in Saudi Arabia and San Francisco. Like it does not matter to them, right? So of
Hmm.
course it's not a problem for corporate Democrats to do all these things. The idea they're not leaning into that enough seems crazy to me. I mean, he mentions in the piece the governor's race in Virginia, but as I recall, Terry McAuliffe actually leaned hard into that.
I was going to say, yeah, he cut
Yeah,
an ad, much like Gavin Newsom, talking about how great Toni Morrison is, and that was in direct response, of course, to Glenn Youngkin's kind of, fear mongering about critical race theory in schools. And I'm not saying that one issue made or
sure.
broke the election, obviously, but I agree with you. Like, I don't think that there is much evidence that leaning into this culture war is actually swaying people. And I would argue that it's actually turning off people. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that,
Yeah.
like, I mean, look, I mean, Terry McAuliffe in that election, I mean, when he's like trying so hard to pander to his team
Hmm.
in the culture war, that he said, that he says, oh, actually, parents shouldn't get to decide, what you learn in school. It's like, okay, in a certain sense, I guess that's right, but it's like, man, like why would you do that, right?
Right,
Like,
right. Yeah, exactly.
that's and I think that again, it's like, okay, if you're just talking about the policy, either the policy is going to be there or it's not. I mean, it's not like I think that we should have a position on it, but I think
Hmm.
that again, you don't have to something you said earlier, right? I mean, you don't have to fight it on your enemy's terms, which I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely doing if you do the thing that Democrats tend to do, which is to frame everything like the only acceptable explanation after McAuliffe lost that race. Like if you were on like left wing, social media, the only acceptable explanation was racism. That was it.
Right.
That was, that like, even though Biden had just won Virginia, like by a lot, right? The previous year, right? Virginia had apparently suddenly become much more racist between 2020 and 2021.
And I think also a not insignificant number of non-white voters flipped to Youngkin. So there's that inconvenient fact as well. But yes, go on.
Sure. I mean, like with Trump, right? I mean, because they like, again, the only explanation that was ever acceptable for why anybody voted for Trump was racism, even though you had the same trends between 2016 and 2020. And the problem with that is, one, if you speak online social justice instead of English, then you will define racist in a way that doesn't require like conscious prejudice, but that's not how most human beings understand that term.
Right.
So if you accuse everybody in like this broad category of being a racist, it just won't ring true to most voters, certainly outside of your camp. And this is also exactly what the Christopher Rufos of the world, like this is the reaction they're aiming at, right? I mean, this is what they want. Like if you fight this not as an issue that's primarily understood in terms of a large percentage of the population like being bad, having bad thoughts in their heads, and and not doing the work, not having the right values. Like if you fight it in those terms, I think you're just going to lose. Whereas if you fight it as an issue about, like universal appeals about free speech, or about the job rights of unionized teachers, and why, by the way, you should have those same rights, like that could be a lot more effective. And it could also just be a lot more effective. Just, I don't know. I mean, I remember like when that election happened, I remember talking to Anna Kasparian about it, and she told me like, why doesn't what McAuliffe should have just said was like, why are we talking about schools? Like what's the, you should be running for school board if you want to talk about this, right? Like, let's talk, let's talk about, but then the problem is whatever ends that sentence, let's talk about like the McAuliffes the world can't do, right? Because like ideally it'd be like, let's talk about healthcare and daycare and jobs and wages, but they can't do that because they don't actually support much of anything on there, which is why I think Bowie is exactly wrong. I mean, I think in that last third of his article that corporate Democrats love culture war stuff because what else would they talk about?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point about the kind of strategy of pivoting to the bread and butter issues. That really only works when you have a bread and butter platform to like back it up, as you were saying.
Right.
But when Chris Rufo first started making noise about the critical race theory stuff, I was paying attention to what various Democrats from sort of center to the more progressive wing were saying, and I noticed that like almost nobody made that pivot, even people who are ostensibly on the progressive side. Like I kind of feel like the most obvious thing to say when Chris Rufo started, beating the drums about critical race theory would be to say, this is insane, spurious bullshit. Let's talk about funding schools. Let's talk about paying teachers more. This was, during the pandemic. So there were obviously concerns about like shutdowns and reopenings and all that. But even that aside, it's like, who's going to what part of the Democratic base is going to argue with funding public education? Let's put more money into schools. Let's support teachers. Let's back their unions. Like that pivot seemed to be the most obvious thing to me. And yet you even have people on the progressive side of the spectrum. Like I'm thinking here of, Jamal Bowman, very similar names, and AOC, who, are politicians that I like, who actually leaned into what we're calling the culture wars, right? Like I remember a long tweet thread by Bowman saying like, well, critical race theory is actually really important for education because it really gives you a sense of, how racism has shaped our laws and how it still continues to affect Black people today. And that may very well be true, but I don't know that that's the winning message.
No, I mean, look, and I should also say, I mean, when you actually look at critical race theory, the real thing, not like the, whatever people imagine is critical race theory when they're trying to stir up contrived nonsense about it, for the public schools, but like the actual thing, I do think that there are some, Adolf Reedy kinds of Marxist criticisms of the real thing that I would tend to agree with, right? That
Yeah.
saying like that I think that that sort of focus on disproportionality, that historically conditioned patterns of disproportionality, the distribution of poverty and all the bad things that go with poverty, is not wrong, but it's very incomplete, and I think and focus on it, I think is unhelpful. Right now,
Hmm.
that said, look, I mean, you could actually be assigning, I don't know, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw in high school classes, and like as long as like whatever. I mean, a good teacher is not trying to tell people what to think; they're just assigning readings, and people discuss them, and they can make up their own mind. And I'm all for that, right? I have
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
problem, I have no problem with that.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's a huge mistake to sort of lead into, well, this is the most important thing we should be fighting about, is
Hmm.
whether, critical race theory is good, or whether the stuff that might get mislabeled, as critical race theory is good. I mean, I think what you said earlier is exactly right. You should be talking, about like, look, if you want to talk about schools, let's talk about, more funding for schools. And you could say, like, there's a way of doing it where you say the principal thing. You say, look, I
Hmm.
believe in free speech. I believe in job rights for teachers. Obviously, I'm against that, but here's what I really want to talk about. And then you do the pivot. Like, I think that I think right now we generally have a problem that,
Yeah.
you said, these are politicians you generally like, and I basically do too, because I think, look, policy preferences by and large, the people you're mentioning are, like, they're pretty good, right? I mean,
Right.
they all want the things that I want, in terms of those substantive positions. But as political communicators, I'm not crazy about them right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
because like I just think like there's two screen grabs that Branko Marketic found a little while ago, that are, one is AOC talking about the 2016 election, and she's
Hmm.
just saying like real standard kind of like, like sort of boilerplate Jacobin stuff about it, right? That like, well, a lot of this is actually displaced economic anxiety, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. And then the other one, she's talking about the 2020 election. She's like, oh, I was really surprised at how many white people are voting for Trump. And like, I think that shows that we need deep anti-racist canvassing. Okay, first of all, I don't know what that means, deep anti-racist canvassing. Are we bringing like Robin DiAngelo door to
Door to
door?
door. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Like, but it just seems like there's such a better model, right?
Right.
If you think about like, Bernie Sanders is never ambiguous about what he thinks about a social policy issue, right?
Yeah.
If you ask him, like, hey, what do you think about abortion? Like there'll be no, fudging it at all, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to do a bad Bernie impression, but say no, that should be, that should be legal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But like he does, but then, but like he's just so relentless about pivoting to the bread and butter stuff,
Yeah.
and every poll has like that's ever been done about this shows that the guy has like massive crossover appeal for Republicans and independents. And
Hmm.
I just
Hmm.
think about Bernie, like when Maureen Dowd was interviewing Bernie like a year ago, and there's that picture of him. He's sitting in like a booth in a diner, holding up this handwritten list of the topics he's going to
Right.
discuss.
Right. Right. Yeah. 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 I think like she tries to ask him about Ariana Grande, and he just pivots, and
It's like,
yeah.
nope, not on the list. Sorry.
Yeah. Not on the list. Yeah.
you
Exactly.
know,
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
I
Yeah.
just
I mean,
wish we could have more socialist politicians who are like that.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I will also say, like, I think one reason why it's so important to pivot away from culture wars is because when you think about the Democratic Party over the last, I don't know, what, like 30, even 40 years, they've been moving to the right on economics, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
Democrats now look much more like the Republicans that on economics than they did obviously during like the New Deal era. But at the same time, you have these fever pitch culture wars. So, for people who have a left economic platform but are maybe like more ambiguous on the cultural stuff, which by the way there are a lot of those people, and they're not all like Archie Bunkers or Nazis or
No.
whatever. That actually describes like a fair amount of people in America. Like, where are those people supposed to go when you have a Democratic Party who that is dialed up to here on culture war issues but isn't talking about the economic stuff?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I did, I guess, like, where my head goes when you say that is I think about a conversation that I had a few weeks ago with this random person. I was like out at a bar, and there's this guy like across the way who sees me and says, "Were you on Joe Rogan?" And like, then he like comes over and
You
like
were.
talks to me because he saw me on Joe Rogan,
Uh-huh.
and
Which, by the
we
way, is a culture war in and of itself, but maybe we can get to that. Sorry,
no,
finish your story.
that's very true, right?
Yeah.
But
But anyway,
like,
yeah, sorry, go on.
but like he likes Joe Rogan, he likes me
Yeah.
on Rogan, and he told me he was a conservative, although after like half an hour of talking to him, I have no idea what that means to him, or I
Right.
sort of do, but like that's
Yeah, yeah,
not.
yeah.
Uh, and within like 15 minutes of talking to this guy, he was like, like I was sort of like rattling off like policy ideas, and he was like good with like most of them, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like Medicare for all, sure, yeah, you shouldn't have to pay for healthcare, pre-K. It's like, yeah, okay, you should have, like somebody look at the kids, whatever. Like
Right.
he said he was uncomfortable with abortion, but I was like pressing him on like what he thought should actually be done. Should people go to jail? So, well, he's not really comfortable with that, right?
Right, right,
Like
yeah.
it's like, and the point is not that I think this guy is going to like become a Jacobin subscriber or anything, but like, or certainly that I convinced him of everything in that half-hour conversation. But it was just really striking to me because so much of the way that we talk about politics, so much of the way that even the sort of like some of the people who are currently kind of the leading representatives of the like even like good social democratic kind of wing of the Democratic Party talk about politics are precisely designed to like shut this guy out of the
Yeah,
conversation,
exactly.
be like, we don't want to talk to you, you're the enemy.
Yeah. I think following from that, maybe I want to wrap up on this last question for you, which
Sure.
is do you think the culture wars have the potential to kind of reshape or realign politics in any way? And what I mean by that is I kind of feel like because of the fever pitch of the culture wars right now, you see some weird alliances happening, and I don't know like how substantive they are, but for example, like you'll have Republicans in Florida being like, we hate corporations now because they are they are like coming out in support of voting rights bills, or they're rejecting our like anti-LGBTQ legislation, and that but then you'll also see like liberals and even some progressives championing those same corporations for taking a moral stand. I think we saw this a lot during the racial reckoning of 2020, where there was a huge amount of corporate outpouring and support
Hmm.
for various racial justice related causes. And I think that even a lot of people who theoretically don't like corporations, or who theoretically should know better, were like kind of like championing like, wow, like the corporations, they really are like kind of stepping up this time. So I don't know. Again, I think it's too early, or at least for me, it's too early to say whether politics are really being realigned. But like that's the fear, right? That like if some sort of self-styled right-wing populist like says the right things on economic policy like just enough, that they then are able to, I don't know, capture the group of people we were talking about earlier who are sort of like left on economics, but a little bit more ambivalent or movable on the cultural stuff. I don't know. Do you think any kind of realignment is happening?
Yeah, in a way. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's like a really important way in which it's not and sort of can't, right? Because I think that there are a lot of voters like you're describing,
Mhm.
but I think there's a reason that aren't any politicians who are really like acted on those preferences, right?
Right.
That like, and like lots of people are full of shit about lots of ways right across the spectrum, but like I do think there's something a little bit unique about how full of shit all the right wing populists are. Like,
Right. Right.
there's no, like there's no right populist version of Bernie Sanders, or there's no right populist version of the Squad for that matter, right? That
Mhm.
there's no like, there's nobody who is like a right winger who like genuinely wants to like I don't know, like do something terrible with like laws about trans people or something, but also like really wants to give everybody health care. Like that doesn't
Right. Right.
exist.
Yeah.
And which in some ways is good because like if that avoids some awkward questions about how you would relate to those people. But,
right.
But I think there's a reason because I just don't like. It's hard enough the Democratic Party because it is still ultimately a party of capital. That they like so. It is still very, very hard ground, for the left fight on. But I mean, the Republican Party, like that is just like that's like the earth has been salted, and like nothing could grow there as far as economic populism.
Yeah.
And I guess the big thing is just like, okay, the reason. And look, can you get like liberals to like corporations way too much because they're like whipped up by culture war stuff? Yeah, for sure, right? Like that much I totally believe is a thing that could shift people right that way. But like no matter how much sort of superficial anti-corporate rhetoric you might get on the right, like I just think there's a pretty hard limit to how far they could really move on economic issues because like the reason we don't have Medicare for all isn't that like nobody's ever like thought about what a good idea it would be, right? Like it's it's not just that like politicians in the U.S. happen to be like assholes in ways that like politicians elsewhere aren't. It's that we have an incredibly weak and disorganized working class, and it can't achieve it. So I mean, like I think. Like if Bernie Sanders had won the election and like a bunch of things and like the congressional elect further down ballot and gone just right, whatever, it would still be incredibly hard to do like any of the things that he ran on doing. And to do it, to overcome that resistance, you need some sort of like organized bloc to that could apply pressure. And at least on that end, I mean, you could imagine as weak as this is right now, right? You could like sort of squint and imagine like unions, playing that role. But there's just like no social force on the right that could do the same thing. So I mean, I think that they could, I don't want anybody to hear this and think I'm saying that's like, oh, there's nothing to worry about there. I think there's actually like tons to worry about like right wingers like sort of adopted this like populist rhetoric because like they could absolutely. I think they could get a lot of mileage out of it, but I just don't think they're actually going to do anything, when they get into power. That's like none of these people, like none of them, like they have, Josh Hawley, whatever, Steve Bannon, whatever, like none of these people like want the most basic things to like make it like easier to organize a union or to give you health care or like any of this stuff because they're Republicans.
Yeah. Have you heard about this thing called the New Right? I feel like it's mostly I feel like it's mostly a media phenomenon. I don't think it's an actual political movement. Certainly not grassroots. I think if anything, it's an intellectual milieu or even subculture. But what do you make of them? Because they're kind of, at least from what I understand of the like various media profiles that have been written, they're kind of a new group that sort of wants to rein in some free market excesses, right? But at the same time, they go very hard on right-wing culture war.
Yeah. So there's like Compact magazine that just started. It's like very much along these lines. There's like a lot of stuff that like Peter Thiel sort of floats around and like seeds some money too that like seems to be like a little bit along these lines, which by the way in and of itself makes me wonder how seriously to take it, right? Billionaire funded populism, but but I don't think that like the people who are like writers maybe who are involved in that are necessarily insincere. I mean, I think a lot of them probably do mean what they're saying and it like makes sense in their heads, but I would just say like I think it's interesting primarily because it shows that like on the right like there is, I mean, it's like kind of an extreme symptom of something you see a lot on the mainstream right, that like that you see like even like your Marco Rubios and like Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz will say, I remember like last year sometimes seeing him on TV saying the phrase the corporate media, like he was like a guest on like Democracy Now! In 2009. It was like, wow, okay. Right.
Marco Rubio frequently says multiracial working class, right? So
right. So like the rhetorical shift even on the mainstream right has been like kind of remarkable. And so it sort of makes sense that you would get these like very earnest, very strange, sometimes very unsavory, right-wing intellectuals who are like sort of trying to like do the sophisticated, version of it, right? I mean, for what it, like whatever, of course, right? I mean, you're gonna have like any movement's gonna, it'll have its, I mean, it'll have its YouTube shows, it'll have its Jacobin, it'll have its catalyst, right? Like there are people who are going to try to be the catalyst for that, so that makes sense. And I think the whole development that it's a symptom of is interesting because I think like on the right, it seems like there's this kind of formula that's worked for them for a really long time where they're just like openly, like very openly pro-corporate on economics, but like there's like enough Jesus on everything else to like make up for it,
Right.
and it sort of seems like that formula is maybe like doesn't have like the kind of rhetorical power that it used to, and now they're like kind of casting around for something else. And so like that is like interesting and revealing, and in a weird way it's encouraging because like if even Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio feel the need to talk this way, right? Like they're trying to appeal to something, right? I mean, there's like some kind of opening for the left there too. But I just think like, okay, it's, as somebody who spends all my time writing articles for magazines, let me just say it's like a lot easier to write articles for magazines than it is to like actually make things happen in the real world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, on that note, Ben, again, I will shout out your show. Give them an argument. That is on YouTube as well. Columnist for Jacobin. I'm sure you have new stuff coming out. Anything you want to plug before we sign off?
No. Well, actually, I guess I will say one new thing in the last few months that's like very strange is that the Daily Beast has a new opinion editor who apparently wants a greater political diversity on the op-ed page that they've ever had before, and so I've been able to write some stuff for them that's like the least Daily Beastish stuff that's ever been written for the Daily Beast. Like there was they're like anti-censorship articles. There's an article called "Neither Party Cares About the Working Class." So. Check that out too, and give them an argument. Is Monday nights at 8:00 Eastern on YouTube.
Check it out. All right, Ben, good to see you. Thanks so much.
All right, so good to see you.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.